Hello, everyone. I'm Betty StPierre from the University of Georgia, and the title of my presentation today is Early Feminist Critiques of Humanism Ground New Feminist Scholarship. One of the things I've learned after many years in academia is that what's called new seldom is new, but instead relies heavily on existing scholarship we may not yet have studied. I found this to be true some years ago when I began reading what's been called the new materialism, which seems an attractive feminist project since women have always been on the wrong side of the discursive, material, and mind-body binaries. My worry has been that the new materialism can perpetuate humanist binary logic by simply shifting our attention to the material side of the binary rather than, as Derrida advised, overturning the structure in which the binary exists so that something different can be thought. The goal in that overturning, in deconstruction, is Derridian différance, or perhaps Deleuzian pure difference, the absolutely new, the unthought, what does not exist but might, the not yet, the to come. A rationale for some new material work is a claim that post-structuralism depends too much on the discursive and ignores the material. But I wonder when I hear that argument, which post-structural scholars, those advocates of new materialism, have studied. Although language and discourse are certainly important in, for example, the work of Foucault and Derrida, both were exquisitely focused on the material. Think of Foucault's work on docile bodies and Derrida's work on the materiality of friendship. What I think we sometimes miss in these arguments that privilege one side of a binary for a while and then the other is a post-structural refusal of humanism's binary logic that would set the discursive against the material to begin with. Post-structuralism's refusal of humanism's dividing practices, its order of things, and its realist ontology, which is obsessed with what is, what exists. Instead, post-structuralism offers an ontology of immanence that does not focus on what exists and how to divide it up and order it into categories, binaries, and hierarchies, but on what is coming into being, the immanent. But immanence is not new either. Think of the work of Spinoza, Nietzsche, Bergson, and Whitehead, who always offered a different system of thought. So the idea that we should focus now on the material and not the discursive is, I think, at least dangerous, if not altogether wrong-headed. In what system of thought can they be separated? Well, in a Cartesian ontology of being. And what is the ethics of their separation? Well, we see that played out every day in power relations when someone says, we have to do it this way or that way, now choose. As if there are not 1,000 alternatives to the two options offered in the binary. As you notice, I just introduced Descartes, and his ontology is credited with foundationalism and binary logic. For Descartes, it's me, the rational human being, who is set against and superior to everything else that exists, to the rest of being, the same and the other. Descartes' ontology organizes taken for granted humanist concepts like human being, reason, truth, and reality into binary oppositions. That's the world the other has lived in for centuries, and that's the world feminists and others resist. And that ontology and its order of things was refused by post-structuralism and feminist post-structuralists decades ago and by other philosophers centuries ago. I emphasize that refusal is not new. So when I teach new materialism, for example, to doctoral students, we go way back in the history of Western thought and begin by studying Aristotle's understanding of matter. We read Descartes, Whitehead, the post-structuralists, and feminists who engaged ontologies of immanence. And we don't get to new materialism until about 2/3 of the way through the course. By then, we have altogether deconstructed that old discursive material binary and struggle to think immanence. I think immanence, an ontology of becoming, is hard to think because a realist ontology is in the air we breathe and the water we drink. It pervades our language and our thought, what Deleuze called the dogmatic image of thought. My question is always, how did a realist ontology win out over an ontology of immanence? How does it keep winning? How, where, and by whom is it perpetuated and maintained? For me, feminist resistance demands resistance to the present, to the taken for granted, to what is. And it encourages the creation of new concepts that might help us invent a new world to come. How then to resist, to refuse the way things are, how they've become normalized? For me, this refusal has taken the form of studying postmodernism, post-structuralism, post-structural feminism, and a specific engagement with and refusal of what I've called conventional humanist qualitative research methodology, which I argue maintains a realist ontology by focusing on finding what really exists, sorting it, naming it, and representing it as if it's real. Pre-existing social science research methodologies rely on a realist ontology, which assumes the world is stable and passive enough to be captured and found by the inquiring subject, what Deleuze called the empirical investigator. But as Aaron Manning wrote, method is an apparatus of capture. Method provides pre-existing processes, practices, and techniques to capture, order, and control what exists. Feminists have always critiqued the scientific method, as well as its installation in social science method. In that way, method ensures that only certain things can be recognized and found. Now, I'm not saying we should valorize the new over what is recognized, but to understand that privileging methodology's model of recognition as a model of what it means to think and be is not only limiting, but is what keeps us stuck, trapped. Post-structuralism's ontology of immanence forced me to think post-qualitative inquiry many years ago, even in my dissertation research, though I didn't have a name for it then. Post-qualitative inquiry does not and cannot have pre-existing methods, practices, or processes. In fact, post-qualitative inquiry doesn't exist. It must be invented over and over again. What post-qualitative inquiry does require is an understanding of post-structuralism's ontology of immanence and its refusal of humanist concepts that pervade research methodologies. When people ask me where to begin post-qualitative inquiry, I say, study post-structuralism, and you won't be able to use those old methodologies. Foucault, for example, wrote that he did not have a method that he applied to different domains, but that he made it up as he went. Deleuze wrote that thought does not need a method, that method belongs in the dogmatic image of thought. Derrida insisted that deconstruction is not a method that is applied. Rather, it is what happens when one takes very seriously something that has been normalized. But it can be difficult to avoid method and research methodologies because they become so pervasive in the social sciences. How then does one inquire without a pre-existing method? What does one do without a recipe? What typically happens to my students who've studied post-structuralism and may also have studied and overstudied methodology is that they find there's something about the research process they just can't do, something they must avoid. For example, I've learned during the last 30 years that students who've studied post-structuralism often refuse interviewing, which privileges capturing the words of someone in a face-to-face conversation as if those words can be brute data, as if the words are the truth of finding. They may also refuse observation, which privileges the accuracy of vision, but nonetheless must be written down in field notes. Again, what you see becomes words, brute data. Social science is, of course, relentlessly textual. So methodology's reliance on the belief that language can capture and contain the world and its meaning, that words can count as data and evidence to warrant a claim, makes no sense after post-structuralism. After all, Derrida wrote that meaning always escapes. What do those students do after those refusals? All kinds of things. If they say they don't want to interview people, I typically say, well, what do you want to do then? And they always have some ideas. So then I say, well, try that and see what happens. And if that doesn't work, try something else. Just do the next thing and see what happens. Don't worry about what you think you should do. I also recommend they begin with a philosophical concept like Deleuze's refrain or Foucault's power or Bergson's duration, which might reorient their thinking about whatever they want to think about. But I remind them that these philosophical concepts are not to be applied. For example, you wouldn't observe a classroom looking for rhizomes. Rather, the philosophical concept rhizome helps you think an ontology of immanence. But I always tell them to study post-structuralism if they want to call their work post-qualitative, because that's where it begins. There are so many ways to inquire, to think, that refuse pre-existing methods and methodologies. I'm always surprised that we continue to rely on them given their limits. I've begun to believe they prevent us from thinking, from inventing, from wrestling with the struggles we must engage in this fragile world that demands our very best. And even though feminists can always be found in the vanguard of refusal, we too can still be trapped in the dogmatic image of thought. How can we share what we've learned to avoid? How can we share what we've come to refuse? And for me especially, how can post-structuralism push me to think and live differently? Thank you.